All right, hello once again. This is Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College, coming to you now from the confines of the faculty offices here at Rankin Technical College, Wentzville. And I'm going over the PowerPoint presentations for Murox ASP.NET 4.6 with C# 2015. We're up to Chapter 24 of 25, and this chapter is how to create and use WCF and Web API services. Our objectives, our applied objectives, are to develop and test a WCF service, to develop an ASP.NET web page that consumes a WCF service, and to develop and test a Web API service. Our knowledge objectives include distinguish between WCF and Web API services. In general terms, describe the service contract interface, service contract class, and data contract class of a WCF service, as well as the use of the service contract, operation contract, data contract, and data member attributes. In general terms, describe the way you would test a WCF service. In general terms, describe the way you would consume a WCF service from an ASP.NET web application. In general terms, describe the use of the terms as they apply to API services, those terms being MVC or Model View Controller, Routing Framework Controller, and Action Method. In general terms, describe the way you test the GET methods of a Web API service, and in general terms, describe the use of JavaScript and jQuery for consuming a Web API service. There are about 4 different programmatic examples in this chapter as well. So, in earlier versions of ASP.NET, Microsoft offered what were called ASMX web services. Then, a little later, they introduced WCF, which stands for Windows Communication Foundation Services. They provided more power and more flexibility than ASMX, but they were more complex. Starting with ASP.NET 4.5, WCF services became easier to use, and because of that, they're often used in place of ASMX services. In addition, with ASP.NET 4.5, Web API services were introduced. These have the goal of developing services that can be easily consumed by browsers and mobile devices. So in this chapter, we'll talk about both. Now, a web service is a class that resides on a web server and can be accessed via the internet or an intranet. Now, if you've listened to my lectures for this class or other classes, you may have heard the analogy that I'm about to give you. Years ago, I took a class during the summer while I was teaching at a different technical college. And in that particular example and what we went through in there, and I'm going to see if I can kind of show it to you, but we'll see whether or not this works. So, insert. Let's do that. No, I don't want word. I want shapes. And I want this. And let's see. All right, when I took this class, and this isn't the greatest picture, but it'll work. All right, what we had was we created the equivalent of text areas, here and here. And then we had 2 buttons, a button here and a button here. The button here, what we put on it, and let's see if I can add any text. I don't remember even how to do this. It's been a while since I've looked at this stuff, so. Well, let's do it like this. This will work. As soon as I can figure out how to draw on here, or how to type in here. Okay, well, all right, that's fine. No. As always, I'll improvise, okay? Oops. Okay, so we'll have this. Not at all what I wanted to do. Pretty much the same size. All right, we'll put that one here. Okay, so what I'm showing you, and not very well, but what I'm showing you here is that would be the text that was on the buttons. So the idea was we created a very simple interface where we had a big text area here and a big text area here. In here we could type in anything we wanted to in English. When we click this button, the idea was we would get the translation of whatever we typed into here in Spanish. In the same way, if we knew Spanish, we could type some Spanish stuff in here, click this button which said Spanish to English, and we get the English interpretation in there. Now, the way that it went back and forth wasn't perfect. It was kind of choppy English, but the idea is that it worked. And just as important to that is the idea that what we did was we didn't write any code to actually do the translation. Rather, what we did was we called what was called a web service. It was, for lack of better words, like an online translator that would go either from English to Spanish or Spanish to English that did the work for us. All right, now hopefully that helped. It didn't hurt in your understanding of this. Again, as mentioned, a web service is a class that resides on a web server and can be accessed via the internet or intranet. Web services provide a way to make useful functions available to clients on other platforms. For instance, the website for the United States Postal Service offers web services that allow you to calculate shipping rates, correct addresses, they allow you to track packages, etc. All right. Web services communicate with clients by using either what's called SOAP, which is the Simple Object Access Protocol, or REST, which is Representational State Transfer, although REST may mean something that is that, but something else kind of close to that, depending on the book that you read. In general, we're going to talk about WCF services, and in general, those WCF services use SOAP. We're also going to talk about Web API, which in general use REST. All right. So what we have here on the picture, and this is taken right from page 837 in our text, is a Windows Communication Foundation service that uses SOAP. SOAP uses XML, which is the extensible markup language, to send data between a host and a client. SOAP can be used over many types of transport media and has security options, but it can be kind of tough to work with. Typically, some sort of proxy class is needed when you work with a SOAP service, but Windows Communication Foundations generally generates the proxy classes for you. So again, this picture illustrates how WCF services work with SOAP. Here, the service is offered by a website that's hosted by IIS, but WCF services can also be hosted by a Windows Forms application, a console app, or a Windows service. However, this chapter focuses on WCF services as hosted by IIS. As shown in the figure, a Windows Communication Foundation or WCF service exposes what are referred to as one or more endpoints. The client then uses SOAP over the Hypertext Transfer Protocol to communicate with one of these endpoints. For this to work, both the client and the server must be running a version of the .NET framework that supports WCF. Advantages of SOAP is that they can be used over many transport media like TCP, MSMQ, and HTTP. All right, and they can also create strict contracts between two parties and add more layers of security. Now, on the other hand, here is an example of a web service that uses a web API service that uses REST. REST uses HTTP and URLs rather than XML, so it's less cumbersome than SOAP. For example, you'll notice that while we needed proxy classes here for SOAP, they are not necessary for REST. In fact, REST services often return JSON, JavaScript object notation, so they can be easily consumed by JavaScript with little or no transformation. This makes REST very popular for AJAX-oriented applications. So what we see on the screen here is an illustration of how API services work with REST. Here the client sends an HTTP request to a specified URL and receives JSON or XML in response. Also, the clients that consume the web API services don't need to have the .NET framework installed. Although you can build REST services with WCF, it requires more configuration than with web API services. So the big advantages of REST relies on the existing HTTP standard, so it's faster and easier to configure, and it can return JSON, JavaScript object notation, which can be consumed almost directly from JavaScript or XML if desired. So a web service on a server, a web service on a host provides a service that can be consumed by clients in different platforms. All right. Now, before we go on, it's important for you to realize that what is happening, or what has been happening over time, is that different companies have sprouted up with the equivalent of online yellow pages. If you're old enough to remember, back in the day, when the phone service wasn't nearly what it is now, you had the yellow pages, where businesses would advertise and give their phone number and have some kind of an ad in there. Well, now there is more or less an electronic yellow pages that you can get to online, where some of these different web service providers will offer their wares. Some of this stuff, like, for example, the translator that we used from English to Spanish or Spanish to English, is free. Other web services cost money. All right? So before we go into how to create a web service, which starts on page 838 and what we have here, we'll stop right now and we will continue that in the next part or the next video.